Put that away right now. Those aren't asthma meds. Those are street drugs. And if you don't hand them over, I'll have security drag you off this plane in front of everyone." Brenda Coleman's words ripped through the cabin with a cruelty that made even seasoned travelers freeze. Her voice sharp enough to slice through the steady hum of the aircraft. A 19-year-old college student had just been accused of smuggling drugs when all she held was the very inhaler that kept her alive. Before I go further, let me pause for a moment. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now, and if you believe stories like this matter. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like so more people can see the truth when injustice happens in plain sight. Now, let's return to the gate at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, where United Airlines Flight 917 was preparing for takeoff to San Francisco. The plane was packed, the aisles jammed with bags sliding overhead, the clock ticking as the crew rushed to make an on-time departure. Passengers shifted impatiently in their seats, checking phones, sending last texts, already planning the hours ahead. In the middle of it all, in seat 23F, sat Ava Wilson, her back pressed into the worn fabric of economy, her Stanford sweatshirt loose across her shoulders, and her breath already shallow as the recycled air settled heavy in her chest. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her confirmed ticket had been for first class, seat 3B, a seat her father had carefully arranged for her. A gate agent had mumbled about a ticketing discrepancy and shuffled her down the aisle with an apologetic shrug, promising it could be fixed later. Ava had chosen not to argue. She had learned from her brother's tragedy. Arguing with authority rarely won you relief, only suspicion. Better to stay calm, to keep breathing steady, to cling to patience the way her brother once told her. Never let injustice take your air before it takes your words. But patience didn't stop the tightening inside her ribs. She had reached for her inhaler the way a drowning swimmer reaches for the surface. And that was when Brenda struck. Brenda Coleman, a flight attendant with 18 years of service, was worn thin by the pressures of a job that had given her more sleepless nights than gratitude. She wore her uniform like armor, pressed and proper, but beneath the fabric was a bitterness she carried from missed promotions and a recent disciplinary review. When she spotted Ava's inhaler, she didn't see a medical device. She saw a potential fraud, a disruption to her schedule, another chance to prove herself by cracking down on a problem passenger. The moment her fingers closed around the inhaler, she announced her suspicion loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Ava tried to explain. She lifted her wrist with the silver medical ID bracelet catching the cabin light, her voice calm despite the panic rising in her lungs. "I have severe asthma," she said, soft but clear. "It's prescribed." Brenda curled her lip in mock disbelief. "That's what they all say. You don't belong up front and you won't get special treatment back here either." Her words stung, not just for what they accused, but for what they implied. That Ava's appearance, her thrift store hoodie, her natural curls, her quiet presence, disqualified her from being believed. From the front cabin, Gregory Holt stirred, a marketing director in seat 4A, his suit sharp and his tone sharper. He craned his neck and seized the moment to amplify Brenda's cruelty. "If she's causing problems, just get her off. We don't need delays." His voice rolled through the aisle like a gavel, steeped in the arrogance of a man used to being obeyed. "Some of us have important places to be." The words landed with a heavy silence, broken only by the faint clicks of phones being raised. Passengers began recording, unwilling to look away. In row 15B, Sophia Alvarez lifted her phone high, her fingers steady though her pulse raced. She was a tech journalist who had tasted discrimination before, and she knew instinctively that this was a moment the world needed to see. Her live stream blinked to life on Instagram, and within a minute 15,000 strangers were watching, 2 rows behind her, in 16D. Zoe Patel tapped her screen and went live on YouTube, narrating details with the precision of someone who had trained herself to document injustice: flight number, seat numbers, names when possible, From 2 cameras, 2 voices, the story began to spread in real time, and in 19C. Dr. Clara Bennett rose to her feet, 60 years old, a retired internist. She hadn't stopped practicing medicine in her mind. She read Ava's symptoms like a textbook, sweat on her temples, the pull of her rib cage with every shallow breath, the fading color in her lips. "That is a rescue inhaler," she said firmly, her voice the kind that once calmed panicked families in emergency rooms. "This young woman is in respiratory distress. Return it now." Brenda pivoted, narrowing her eyes, her grip on the inhaler white-knuckled. "Ma'am, sit down. We don't need theatrics. TSA will handle this." Clara did not flinch. "This isn't theatrics. It's hypoxia, and hypoxia doesn't wait for paperwork." Ava tried to hold her composure, but the edges of her vision blurred. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, pressed the screen, and called the one person who could anchor her, her father, Admiral Michael Wilson. The ring connected, and his steady voice filled her ear. "Ava, are you on board?" She tried to answer, but the words cracked into coughing. She pressed the phone against her chest so he could hear the rasp of her breath, the proof of her struggle. His voice sharpened with alarm. "Stay calm. I'm here." Brenda's announcement came like a hammer. "TSA will remove her. She is non-compliant." Gregory clapped once, satisfied, muttering to the aisle, "Finally, some order." The moment felt like a tightening vice, authority closing in, hierarchy grinding forward. A young woman gasping for air while strangers held cameras but not power. Yet amid the chaos, voices of truth refused to quiet. Sophia's livestream comments flashed across her screen. "Give her the medicine. This is illegal. #Justice for Ava." Zoe's camera caught Gregory smirking, his arrogance recorded for millions. Dr. Clara stood planted, unwavering, and Ava, with barely enough breath to speak, lifted her head, looked straight at the supervisor who had just arrived, and whispered the simplest plea of all, "Please, give it back." That was the spark. The moment when injustice revealed itself not as a private humiliation, but as a public crime of dignity denied. A cabin full of passengers sat suspended between silence and action, watching the line between order and cruelty blur, and somewhere beyond the airport walls, tens of thousands of strangers were already witnessing the truth through 2 live streams, their voices gathering like a storm. Ava's chest rose and fell in jagged, shallow bursts, her fingers clenching the armrest as the burn in her lungs deepened, and the once quiet murmur of passengers swelled into a low roar of tension. Brenda Coleman stood firm at the center of it, inhaler still clutched in her hand like contraband, her voice cutting through the air. "Security is on the way, so sit down before you make this any worse." The words sent a wave of unease through the cabin, some passengers shifting nervously in their seats, others lifting phones higher. But it was Dr. Clara Bennett who refused to back down, her 60 years of authority and calm pressing forward as she leaned into the aisle, voice strong. "You are denying life-saving medication to a patient in visible distress, and if she loses consciousness, that's on you." Brenda's jaw tightened, eyes darting toward the cockpit door as if searching for backup. But none came, so she doubled down, calling Ava non-compliant and suspicious, words that hung heavy with implication. In 4A. Gregory Holt seized the moment, raising his voice so the whole cabin could hear. "This is ridiculous. Rules are rules, and if she can't follow them, she's a risk to all of us. Get her off the plane so we can leave." His tone dripped with arrogance, trying to rally the first-class passengers, but the faces around him looked less convinced than before. Sophia Alvarez, still streaming live to an audience that had swelled to 100,000 viewers, turned her phone toward Gregory, narrating. "That's Gregory Holt, marketing director, insisting a 19-year-old gasping for air is the reason we're delayed." Comments exploded on her screen. "Monsters. Give her the inhaler. United is finished. Meanwhile, Zoe Patel's YouTube stream had surged past 70,000 views. Her voice calm but unyielding as she documented every detail, capturing Brenda's trembling hand, the beads of sweat on Ava's brow, the ripple of discontent spreading through the rows. The hashtags United Airlines Fail and Justice for Ava trended simultaneously, a digital storm rising faster than the engines could warm. Ava's vision blurred. She thought of her brother, of how his last moments had been stolen by a delay in treatment, and the memory pushed her to hold on, to fight, even as each breath scraped like sandpaper in her lungs. She whispered to herself, "Don't let them win. Breathe through it," repeating his words like prayer. Brenda, her own frustrations bleeding into cruelty, flashed back to the incident years earlier when a passenger faked illness, costing her a promotion she still resented, in Ava. She saw not a student fighting for breath, but another reminder of her career slipping away. Gregory leaned back in his seat, tapping impatiently at his watch, muttering about lawsuits and delays. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, because buried in his past was a discrimination case he thought he'd buried, and now cameras were aimed at him, capturing his disdain. In the aisle, Laura Mendez, the flight supervisor, arrived with authority in her step, her gaze scanning the scene, and though her instinct urged her to back her senior attendant, doubt flickered when she saw Ava's medical bracelet glint and Clara's unwavering stance. Passengers began murmuring louder, some saying, "Give her the inhaler. She's sick," while others muttered nervously about TSA being called. The cabin was no longer under Brenda's control. It was slipping into the hands of the passengers and the millions watching online. Ava's lips darkened, the faintest blue creeping in, her shirt damp with sweat. And Clara's voice grew sharper, urgent. "If you don't act now, this becomes a life-or-death situation. Do you understand me?" Still, Brenda held firm, though her face betrayed the fear of being wrong in front of a camera. And Gregory tried to rescue her authority by booming, "This flight doesn't revolve around one person. Remove her already." The words only deepened the divide, as Sophia captured his tirade, narrating, "This is the sound of arrogance over empathy." And the comments rolled in faster, thousands of strangers demanding action. Ava clutched her phone, too weak to speak, but her father's name lit the screen. Admiral Michael Wilson calling back, and she answered with trembling hands, pressing it to her chest so the sound of her ragged breaths filled his ear. "Ava?" His voice came through, sharp, commanding, and though she could not answer, the sound of him gave her strength. Brenda's eyes widened slightly, realizing for the first time this young woman had someone powerful on the other end of the line. But still she pressed her stance, insisting protocol demanded TSA intervention. Laura nodded reluctantly, defaulting to hierarchy, but her voice lacked conviction. "We'll let TSA handle it." Passengers groaned audibly, some shouting, "She needs her inhaler now," while others muttered about missing connections. The tension thickened, the divide between authority and compassion sharpening with each second. And through it all, Ava fought for breath, for dignity, for survival, her resolve burning brighter even as her body weakened. Online, the storm raged. Clips of Brenda's accusations spread across platforms, hashtags multiplying, journalists picking up the feed. What began as one woman's humiliation was becoming a public reckoning, a test of whether decency could triumph over pride. And in that pressurized cabin, with security minutes away and millions already watching, the storm had only just begun. The cabin jolted with a new wave of tension when two uniformed TSA agents stepped through the doorway, their presence shifting the atmosphere from uneasy discomfort to outright fear. But before they could move down the aisle, Ava Wilson's phone, still on speaker, crackled with the commanding voice of Admiral Michael Wilson, a voice that carried both paternal urgency and the unmistakable authority of a man who had spent decades leading in the Navy and now held one of the highest positions at United Airlines. "This is Admiral Michael Wilson, Vice President of Flight Operations for United Airlines, and you will put me on speaker immediately." His words cut through the cabin with such force that Brenda Coleman froze mid-sentence, her hand still wrapped around the confiscated inhaler as if it were evidence in a trial. Laura Mendez, the flight supervisor, hesitated but obeyed, pressing the phone against the intercom so that his voice filled the cabin. "Ms. Coleman, you are in direct violation of federal law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, by denying a medically necessary device to a passenger in distress," Michael thundered, his tone brooking no argument. "You are not only jeopardizing her life, you are jeopardizing this airline, this crew, and every single passenger on board." Brenda opened her mouth to retort, but the force of his voice left her momentarily stunned. And in that silence, Ava struggled for another breath, her chest heaving, her lips now a frightening shade of blue. Dr. Clara Bennett stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on Ava's shoulder, and looked directly at the TSA agents. "If you remove this passenger without returning her inhaler, you are complicit in medical negligence," she said, her words sharp, precise, the voice of a physician who had argued with bureaucracy before and won. The TSA agents glanced at one another, clearly uncomfortable, suddenly caught between the orders of a flight attendant and the authority of a vice president ringing through the intercom. From the front cabin, Gregory Holt rolled his eyes and scoffed loudly, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "Oh, come on," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Now we're supposed to believe she's the daughter of some executive? This is theater. Some college kid pulls a stunt and suddenly it's a national crisis." He smirked directly into the phones that recorded him, not realizing that his arrogance was fueling the very fire he sought to extinguish. Zoe Patel's live stream caught every word, zooming in on his smug expression as she narrated calmly. "This is Gregory Holt, marketing director, dismissing a dying girl as a stunt. Remember his face. Within moments, her comment section exploded with outrage. Hashtag marketing bias surging alongside hashtag justice for Ava. Viewers calling for boycotts of his company, tagging sponsors, demanding accountability. Gregory's face, once just another passenger's, was now being etched into the collective fury of millions watching live. Michael's voice rang out again. More personal now, less executive, more father. "Ava, sweetheart, hold on for me, I'm on my way." The firmness of his words carried both love and power, a father unwilling to let bureaucracy decide whether his daughter lived or died. Brenda, trembling now but too proud to back down, clutched the inhaler tighter, her knuckles white. "Sir," she said into the phone, her voice wavering but still defiant, "I am following protocol." The cabin erupted. Passengers shouted in unison, "No, you're not, and give her the inhaler." Michael's reply came like a hammer. "Your protocol ends where federal law begins. You are ordered, by me, as Vice President of Flight Operations, to return that inhaler immediately." His words carried such weight that even Laura stepped back, her face pale as the realization dawned that she had aligned herself with the wrong side of history. Ava's body slumped slightly, her strength waning, and Clara raised her voice again, commanding, "We have minutes, maybe less. This is critical." Sophia Alvarez, her phone still live, wiped a tear from her cheek as she narrated for her hundreds of thousands of viewers. A young woman is being denied her inhaler right now, and her father, a United executive, is fighting for her life over the phone. The sheer humanity of the moment. A father's desperation breaking through corporate formality, spread like wildfire across the internet. CNN and NBC anchors interrupted programming with breaking news banners, replaying clips from Sophia and Zoe's streams. The words hashtag United Airlines fail scrolling across the bottom of screens in living rooms and airports nationwide. Gregory tried again. This time more desperate, his earlier arrogance cracking under the weight of global attention. He leaned forward, shouting, "This is chaos! You're all being manipulated! She's not sick! She's acting!" His words rang hollow, drowned out by Ava's wheezing breaths and the sight of her body trembling. Zoe caught the moment perfectly, captioning it live. Gregory Holt calls this acting. The backlash was immediate, his name trending within minutes as users dug up old lawsuits, tweets, and corporate ties, his carefully built reputation unraveling in real time. He reached for his phone, frantically texting an assistant, "Damage control, now." But Zoe, sharp-eyed and quicker than he could have imagined, caught the glow of his screen in her live stream, zooming in as viewers screenshot the message and spread it with glee, birthing yet another trending tag, "Gregory Damage Control." Laura, visibly shaken, whispered to Brenda, "Maybe we should—" But Brenda cut her off, still clinging to the illusion of authority, though her hands betrayed her, trembling as they held the inhaler. It was Michael's next words that shattered her final defense. "Ms. Coleman." "Listen to me carefully," he said, his tone deadly calm. "Your annual salary is $72,000. The average discrimination lawsuit costs this airline $3.8 million. United Airlines generated $63 billion last year, and you are about to risk damages worth 50 times your career earnings because you refuse to return a $5 inhaler to a passenger with a documented medical condition. You are done. Either hand it over now, or you will not only lose your job, you will face legal consequences personally. The weight of those numbers, the cold calculation of consequences, silenced even Gregory, who sank back into his seat, his face drained of color. The passengers, the TSA agents, even Laura, all stared at Brenda, waiting. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Clara stepped closer, her hand outstretched, her voice both firm and compassionate. "Let me help her. Please." Brenda's eyes flicked between the camera phones, the doctor's steady gaze, the slumped figure of Ava gasping for life, and the phone in her hand still blasting Michael Wilson's relentless authority. Her grip weakened, the inhaler slipping slightly. For the first time that evening, she looked less like an authority and more like a woman cornered by the truth. The breaking point had come. Passengers leaned forward, phones raised, breaths held, the cabin suspended in a moment where one woman's choice would decide the line between tragedy and justice. And while Brenda hesitated, the world outside the cabin had already decided. Millions of voices demanding justice, news outlets framing it as a defining moment in airline accountability, hashtags roaring across platforms. The tide had turned. The humiliation that began with a cruel accusation was transforming into a reckoning that no airline, no attendant, no arrogant passenger could stop. Ava's body shuddered, her strength ebbing, but her father's voice through the phone carried her, "Hold on. Ava, just hold on." And with every camera pointed, every heart racing, the world waited for the inhaler to return to the hands that needed it most. The cabin fell into a silence so thick it pressed against every chest when Admiral Michael Wilson appeared at the doorway of Flight 917, his tall frame cutting a figure of authority that silenced even the TSA agents who had come to remove his daughter. He walked down the aisle with the steady, deliberate steps of a man who had once commanded fighter jets and now commanded an entire airline's operations. His eyes locked on Brenda Coleman, who still clutched Ava's inhaler as though it were a badge of her power. And when he reached row 23, he didn't shout. He spoke with a calm that carried more weight than anger ever could. "You will hand that inhaler back to my daughter this instant." The words, delivered low and steady, reverberated like a verdict, and passengers leaned in closer, phones raised higher, because they knew they were watching the moment the tide turned. Brenda's face flushed crimson, her jaw set, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she tried to mask her fear with indignation. "Sir," she said, voice sharp but unsteady. This passenger was non-compliant and presented a threat to safety. Michael raised a single finger, cutting her off without raising his voice. "Stop right there. My daughter is 19 years old. She is a Stanford student traveling to a technology conference. She wears a medical bracelet. She carries a prescription inhaler. The only threat here is your arrogance and your refusal to recognize a medical emergency." He turned slightly, sweeping the cabin with his gaze, and then locked his eyes back on Brenda. "You have two choices. Resign your position right now, or face termination and personal liability for the damages you've already caused." The cabin gasped, a collective intake of breath at the severity of the ultimatum, before Brenda could respond. "Doctor..." Clara Bennett stepped forward, reaching for the inhaler with hands steadier than Brenda's trembling grip. "She doesn't have another minute," Clara said firmly, and without further hesitation. Brenda's fingers loosened, the inhaler falling into Clara's palm like a surrendered weapon. Clara wasted no time, cupping Ava's chin and guiding the device to her lips, pressing it once, twice, as Ava drew ragged breaths, the medication rushing into her constricted lungs. The sound of her inhaling, of her chest rising more fully, was like thunderous relief rolling through the cabin. A murmur of applause began at the back, swelling into cheers, passengers clapping, some crying, many shouting, "Let her breathe." Ava blinked, the blur in her vision clearing just enough to see her father's face above her, stern but filled with a father's love. And she whispered, hoarse but determined, "I'm okay, Dad." He squeezed her hand, his lips tightening with regret. "I should have been here sooner," he said softly. His words meant only for her, though every camera captured the intimacy of that moment. A father's admission in the middle of chaos. Meanwhile, Gregory Holt in 4A tried to slip quietly into the aisle, his expensive leather bag in hand, hoping to slide past unnoticed. But Sofia Alvarez was faster. She swung her camera toward him, narrating to her hundreds of thousands of viewers. "And here's Gregory Holt, the executive who called this a stunt and demanded Ava's removal, now trying to escape accountability." Zoe Patel captured him from the other angle, her voice cool and cutting. "Running when the truth comes out." Gregory's face, pale and panicked, filled the live streams, and the internet devoured it instantly, his name trending across platforms with demands for resignation from his own company. He muttered something about a meeting, but the crowd wasn't listening. Every eye in that cabin was fixed on him, as if the weight of collective shame pressed him back into his seat. Laura Mendez, the flight supervisor, stepped forward then, wringing her hands, her voice faltering as she tried to explain. "Sir, I followed my senior attendant's lead. I didn't want to." Michael turned sharply, his voice firm but not cruel. "You had a chance to correct a wrong and you chose silence. Silence is complicity. Don't ever forget that." Laura's eyes filled with tears, her attempt at apology evaporating in the gravity of his words. The lesson was not lost on the passengers either. Phones captured everything. The moment a corporate vice president declared that inaction was as dangerous as prejudice, a statement that would ripple far beyond that plane. Michael then turned back to Brenda, his voice rising for the first time. Steel cutting through the cabin. "Do you understand what you've done? You put a young woman's life at risk. You humiliated her in front of strangers. You stained the reputation of this airline, and you did it not out of duty, but out of bias and pride." Brenda's lips quivered as she tried to hold back tears. "I was following policy," she whispered, almost to herself. Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear, though the cameras caught every syllable. Policies don't discriminate. People do. And you will answer for this. He pulled a document from his briefcase, already prepared termination papers, and placed them in her hands. Resign now, or the lawyers will handle it. Brenda stared at the papers, her career collapsing in her hands, her tears spilling freely now as the enormity of her actions came crashing down. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she signed, handing the papers back like a surrender flag. The cabin erupted again, a mixture of relief and catharsis, passengers cheering, chanting Ava's name, while Brenda, escorted by TSA, walked the long aisle of shame out of the aircraft. Through it all, Ava breathed easier with every passing second, the medication loosening the grip on her lungs. Her father knelt beside her, brushing her curls back from her forehead, whispering, "I've been distant since your brother, but not anymore. Never again." Ava's eyes filled with tears at his words, not just from the attack, but from the healing she had longed for since her brother's death. Sophia and Zoe caught the moment from both angles, the image of a father holding his daughter, the power of love standing taller than prejudice, and their audiences erupted, millions watching live, millions more sharing clips, the hashtags multiplying, justice for Ava, let her breathe, united accountability. Gregory, cornered by the storm, grew defensive again, shouting over the cheers, "This isn't fair, she caused this." But no one listened anymore. His voice was drowned out by applause, by chants, by the unified rejection of cruelty. The internet tore into him, his old lawsuits resurfacing, his arrogance replayed endlessly. His downfall had begun in that very aisle, under the gaze of a cabin that had chosen to record rather than remain silent. The showdown was over, but its echoes were just beginning. Ava was safe in her father's arms, Brenda's resignation sealed, Gregory exposed, Laura chastened, and the passengers electrified by the realization that they had just witnessed history in motion. What began as an accusation of street drugs had become a public reckoning, a moment where authority was challenged, injustice confronted, and truth prevailed under the relentless gaze of millions. And as the plane sat still at the gate, the world outside erupted, the story already on every major news outlet, a symbol of accountability in the age of live streams. For Ava, it was a victory hard won. For Brenda, the end of a career built on shaky ground. For Gregory, the unraveling of arrogance. And for Michael Wilson, the vindication of both a father's love and a leader's resolve. The cabin felt lighter now, the air easier to breathe, because justice, at least for this moment, had been delivered. The cabin of United Airlines Flight 917 remained at the gate, humming with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Passengers sitting wide-eyed, some clutching phones still streaming, others whispering to each other in disbelief, as Admiral Michael Wilson stood in the aisle like a sentinel of justice, his daughter Ava Wilson at his side, finally breathing steady again after the inhaler's medication had opened her lungs. Brenda Coleman, red-eyed and broken, had been escorted off moments earlier by TSA with her resignation in hand. The image of her walk of shame already splashed across live streams and news channels. But the story wasn't finished. The demand for accountability hung heavy in the air. And Michael, never one to leave a mission incomplete, straightened his jacket, glanced at Laura Mendez, the flight supervisor still trembling near the galley, and raised his voice so that every passenger and every camera could hear, "This incident will not end with a quiet removal and a forgotten apology. United Airlines will issue a public statement tonight, admitting fault, apologizing to every passenger on this flight, and promising corrective action, or I will personally see to it that those responsible are held accountable in a court of law." The words sent a shiver through the cabin. Passengers clapped again, some shouting, "Yes, and tell them," while others murmured about how rare it was to hear someone in his position speak so plainly. And across social media, the clips flooded in, the hashtag United Accountability surging alongside Justice for Ava. Millions of viewers now not just outraged but galvanized. Sofia Alvarez, phone still raised, spoke softly into her stream. "You're watching history in real time. Admiral Michael Wilson, Vice President of Flight Operations, demanding public accountability in front of passengers and cameras." And her feed exploded with hearts. Comments pouring in, viewers calling her courageous for documenting every second, calling Ava a hero for enduring, and demanding that airlines across the industry take notice. In row 16, Zoe Patel steadied her camera and narrated too, her voice calm but edged with passion. "This is why we live stream. This is why we don't look away. Without these cameras, Ava might have been dragged off as a non-compliant passenger. Instead, the truth is undeniable, as Ava leaned back into her seat. Still pale but recovering, Clara Bennett stayed close, monitoring her pulse and breathing, her doctor's instinct refusing to rest until she was certain Ava was safe. "You'll need fluids and rest," she murmured. "But you'll be okay now." Ava nodded weakly, whispering, "Thank you." Her gratitude carried across the cabin, and the applause swelled again. Passengers clapping not just for Ava but for Clara, for Sophia and Zoe, for every voice that refused silence. Michael raised his hand for quiet and added, "This young woman will be seated in 3B, where she was meant to be all along, and she will complete this journey with dignity intact." Laura scrambled to make it happen, her face burning with shame. As two crew members escorted Ava forward, passengers watching with a mixture of respect and relief as she walked slowly. Inhaler clutched tight now in her own hands, her father steadying her with every step. The sight of her returning to her rightful seat felt symbolic, a restoration of order not just for her, but for every passenger who had watched injustice play out before their eyes. Meanwhile, Brenda's absence was still palpable. Whispers filled the rows about her tearful resignation. Some passengers shaking their heads at the stubbornness that had nearly cost a life. Others noting bitterly that she wasn't the first crew member to cross the line, but she had become the one caught in the age of live streams. Gregory Holt, trapped in his seat near the front, squirmed as phones still pointed his way. The internet already dissecting his smirk, his dismissive comments, his text for damage control. He tried to keep his head down, but Sophia caught him on camera again, her voice sharp now. And there sits Gregory Holt, who mocked Ava and demanded her removal, now silent while the world watches. The comments on her feed lit up, viewers calling for his resignation, some tagging his employer, others digging into his history, the tide of accountability sweeping him into its current whether he admitted it or not. As the cabin settled, Michael turned to Laura one last time, his voice measured but unflinching. "You will file a report tonight, and in that report you will document every detail accurately. The confiscation, the denial, the live streams, and the intervention. No spin, no cover-up, if I see anything less than the truth. You will join her in resignation." Laura's head bowed, her voice barely audible. "Yes, sir." The lesson was clear. Silence had consequences, too. By then, the story had already leapt beyond the cabin. News anchors spoke over live feeds. Lawyers weighed in on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Advocacy groups issued statements, and millions of strangers across the world were already invested in Ava's safety, her dignity, her future. And when Michael placed his arm around his daughter's shoulders and guided her into her first-class seat, the image was captured from every angle, shared, reposted, immortalized as a moment of justice reclaimed. Ava leaned her head against his shoulder, whispering, "Dad." They listened. They finally listened. And though his eyes were damp, he only kissed the top of her head and replied, "Because you didn't give up." The applause that followed was softer this time, almost reverent, as though the cabin itself recognized that something larger than a flight delay had occurred. It was a fight for recognition, for fairness, for breath itself, and the victory, though fragile, was real. Sophia and Zoe signed off their streams with promises to continue covering the aftermath, their follower counts skyrocketing in real time, turning them overnight into unlikely champions of justice. Clara scribbled notes on a scrap of paper to send Ava her personal number, promising to check in after the flight and the passengers. Once restless about departure times, now sat hushed, humbled, aware that they had witnessed something that would not fade by the time they landed. For Brenda Coleman, escorted out into the night, the end of her career had come swifter than she ever imagined. For Gregory Holt, his downfall was just beginning. For Laura, the sting of complicity would mark her choices forever. And for Ava, though her chest still ached and her body trembled from the attack, she had already become a symbol far greater than herself, a young woman who refused to let cruelty dictate her fate, whose fight for breath became a fight for justice in front of the world. And so the cabin waited, suspended at the gate, as Admiral Michael Wilson, no longer just an executive but a father who had stood for his daughter with unshakable force, prepared to face the world outside the plane with the same determination. Inside, passengers exhaled at last, some wiping tears, some holding the hands of strangers they had never spoken to before, united by the reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the cramped aisle of an airplane. When someone finally says, "Enough," the engines finally roared to life. A deep vibration running through the cabin as United Airlines Flight 917 began its long-delayed journey toward San Francisco. Yet the air inside was not tense anymore. It was electric, charged with the knowledge that what had happened on this flight was already echoing far beyond the runway, and Ava Wilson, now seated properly in her first-class seat 3B with her father at her side, clutched her inhaler like both a shield and a symbol, her breathing steadier but her mind still replaying the humiliation, the fear, and the relief of survival. Her father's hand rested on hers, firm and grounding, as he whispered that she had nothing left to prove, that the world had seen everything, and that from this night forward things would change. Indeed, change had already begun. By the time the wheels lifted off the tarmac, United Airlines' official Twitter account had issued a statement acknowledging an incident involving a passenger's medical device and promising an immediate review of policy. But the statement, carefully worded and sanitized, only fanned the flames online, as Sofia Alvarez's Instagram stream replayed with nearly 2.5 million total views, viewers commenting furiously that words weren't enough. And Zoe Patel's YouTube channel had exploded overnight with subscriptions, her footage dissected on cable news as anchors declared that the age of passenger accountability had arrived. Inside the cabin, passengers refreshed feeds and gasped at how quickly the story had gone global. Strangers across the world sending prayers for Ava, lawyers tweeting about ADA violations, and activists demanding legislative hearings. What had started as one young woman's fight for her breath was already a national conversation. Ava leaned her head against the window, the city lights shrinking below, and thought of her brother, whose life had been stolen years ago by another mishandled medical emergency. She whispered a promise to herself that his memory would not fade into statistics, that she would carry him forward in every choice she made. Admiral Michael Wilson, though outwardly composed, carried his own weight of regret. He had buried himself in work after his son's death, becoming more distant from Ava, convincing himself that protecting the airline was somehow protecting her too. But tonight had stripped away those illusions, reminding him that his greatest duty was not to shareholders or schedules, but to his child, who had nearly died in front of the world because of prejudice and negligence. He resolved then and there to use every ounce of his authority to ensure that no one else endured what Ava had faced. The announcements came swiftly in the days and weeks after the flight landed. United Airlines pledged to invest $18 million into a mandatory 50-hour training program for every crew member on medical devices and emergency recognition. They unveiled a new medical alert app, allowing passengers to register conditions before boarding so that no bracelet or explanation would ever be dismissed again. Rival airlines, seeing the fury of the public, followed quickly, Delta and Southwest announcing similar programs, unwilling to risk being the next target of viral outrage. Civil rights organizations hailed Ava as the spark that had forced an industry to act. Within months, reported complaints of denied medical devices during flights plummeted by over 80%, a change both measurable and deeply human in its impact. For Ava, the ripples reached into her own life too. Stanford University announced that her courage had earned her a special scholarship boost, citing her as a student leader of resilience and advocacy, a recognition that not only honored her, but secured her path toward a future in artificial intelligence and ethics, the field she had dreamed of shaping. Sofia Alvarez, who had once struggled as a journalist to have her voice heard, found herself invited to speak at a civil rights conference in New York. Her footage cited as proof of social media's power to hold corporations accountable. And for the first time, she felt that her years of fighting against silence had a purpose recognized by the world. Zoe Patel, whose freelance work had barely paid her rent, signed her first major magazine deal. Her expose on the flight and the wider issue of discrimination in airlines landing her on the front cover of a national publication. She had always said she wanted her journalism to make a difference. And now, because she had pressed go live at the right moment, she was changing lives. And then there was Gregory Holt, the once arrogant marketing director who had scoffed and smirked at Ava's suffering. His downfall was swift and merciless. Internet sleuths resurfaced an old discrimination case he had settled quietly years earlier. And when his employer saw his face plastered across millions of screens, mocking a young black woman gasping for air, they had no choice but to fire him. His name became synonymous with callousness, a cautionary tale for executives everywhere about the cost of arrogance in the age of transparency. Through it all, Ava grew stronger, not just physically, but in spirit. She began speaking to journalists about her experience, not as a victim, but as an advocate, telling them, "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been dismissed, doubted, or endangered because someone thought they knew better than a doctor, better than a patient, better than the truth." Her words resonated across generations, especially among older Americans who remembered fights for civil rights in other eras and saw in Ava a continuation of that long struggle for dignity. Michael, too, was transformed. No longer just the vice president of flight operations, he became the face of reform inside United, pushing for broader diversity and sensitivity programs, fighting resistance from executives who grumbled about costs, reminding them with steel in his voice that a lawsuit costs more than training, and a life costs more than any balance sheet. For the first time since his Navy days, he felt not just like an administrator, but like a leader with purpose. On Flight 917 itself, the passengers who had borne witness to it all carried the story into their own lives. Some wrote letters to Congress. Others spoke to local media. Many simply told friends and family about the night they saw injustice stopped in its tracks. The cabin, once just a collection of strangers, had become a community united by a single moment of moral clarity. As the weeks passed, Ava's name trended less on social media, but the policies remained, the reforms deepened, and the story continued to be cited in law classes, corporate ethics seminars, and advocacy campaigns. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It was a case study in the power of ordinary people, armed with phones and voices, to demand change from institutions that had ignored them too long. Ava herself carried the weight of it with grace. She told friends that she still dreamed of the moment Brenda ripped the inhaler from her hands, still felt the echo of panic when her lungs seized. But she used that memory as fuel, not fear. Each breath she took now felt like a reminder of her brother, of her father's love, of the passengers who clapped for her, of the millions of strangers who typed her name with hashtags of support. She was no longer just a student on her way to a conference. She was a symbol, whether she wanted it or not, of courage that had rippled outward until it changed the world. And so, as Flight 917 cruised through the night sky toward San Francisco, the cabin quiet at last. Ava sat upright in her seat, her father beside her. The lights dimmed, the passengers finally drifting into uneasy sleep. While out beyond the window, the stars burned cold and constant. She knew her life would never be the same. Neither would the industry. Neither would the millions who had watched her fight for breath and, by doing so, reminded the world that dignity is not a privilege, but a right. 8 months later. The story that began in the cramped aisle of United Airlines Flight 917 reached the marble halls of Capitol Hill, where Ava Wilson sat before a congressional committee, her back straight, her Stanford blazer crisp, her inhaler resting on the table like both a weapon and a wound. And when she opened her mouth, the room stilled as though every senator, every aide, every reporter knew they were about to hear more than testimony. They were about to hear a legacy being spoken into existence. One moment of injustice can change the world. If we act, Ava began, her voice calm, steady, but threaded with the weight of memory. She told them of the night her inhaler was ripped from her hands, of the flight attendant who called it street drugs, of the passengers who stayed silent until they didn't, of the strangers who lifted their phones and refused to let the truth die unseen. She spoke of the way her lips turned blue, of the panic clawing at her chest, of the way her father's voice through a phone line gave her just enough strength to hold on, and of the miracle that millions of strangers, watching live through Sofia Alvarez and Zoe Patel's cameras, became her allies in that moment. But she didn't stop with herself. Ava spoke for the thousands who had written to her since, passengers with insulin pumps, with heart monitors, with seizure medications, all telling stories of being doubted, dismissed, or endangered in the skies. "This isn't just about asthma," she said firmly. "It's about dignity. It's about whether a passenger's life is an inconvenience or a responsibility." Behind her sat Admiral Michael Wilson, now United's chief diversity officer. His once hardened expression softened with pride and regret. Pride in the daughter who had turned survival into advocacy. Regret that he hadn't seen sooner how much she needed him after her brother's death. Senators leaned forward, some visibly moved. As Ava laid out the facts, medical discrimination complaints had risen 24% the year prior. But since the launch of the Medical Alert app, now adopted by 20 airlines, incidents had fallen by 87%. She praised United's $18 million investment in training, but she pushed further, urging Congress to enshrine those protections in law with a $28 million budget so that no policy shift, no leadership change, could undo what passengers had fought for with their breath. Her voice only wavered once, when she spoke of her brother, how his death from a mishandled emergency haunted her, how she had heard his voice urging her to stay calm on that flight, and how she now carried him with her into every breath. The room fell silent. Reporters' pens stilled, and even the most stoic senators bowed their heads in respect. The ripple effects of that night were already clear. Brenda Coleman, once so rigid in her authority, now stocked shelves at a Chicago supermarket, humbled, telling co-workers in rare moments that arrogance had cost her everything. Gregory Holt, the marketing director who mocked Ava, had been fired within weeks, his old discrimination case resurfacing, his name now shorthand for hubris in the age of live streams. Laura Mendez, the supervisor who had chosen silence, Still worked at United, but now led training sessions, telling new hires. I stayed quiet once, and it cost me my integrity. Don't repeat my mistake. By contrast, those who chose to act had risen. Dr. Clara Bennett was celebrated as the physician who refused to sit down. Sofia Alvarez had become a leading voice in advocacy journalism, invited to conferences nationwide. And Zoe Patel had secured a major magazine column and was writing a book about the flight called Breathe, the Night That Changed Everything. Their lives, like Ava's, had been irrevocably shaped by the choice to see and to speak. When Ava finished her testimony, the gallery broke into applause, rare, even frowned upon in those chambers, but unstoppable, and the committee chair allowed it, recognizing that history had just been made outside. The steps of Capitol Hill swarmed with cameras, and Ava stood before them, inhaler still in hand, her father by her side, declaring, "This fight was never just mine. It belongs to every person who has ever been silenced or doubted. Together we proved that justice can board a plane and demand to be heard. Together we turned humiliation into reform. And together we are building a world where no one has to beg for the right to breathe." The words echoed across networks, into living rooms, onto phones, across continents. Her image now not just a symbol of survival, but of transformation. And so the young woman once shoved into seat 23F, accused of carrying drugs instead of medicine, became the catalyst for industry-wide reform. A voice whose courage reshaped laws, a daughter whose ordeal mended the distance with her father, and a leader whose legacy reminded the world that dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Brenda's tears, Gregory's downfall, Laura's lesson, Sophia and Zoe's rise, Clara's defiance, all of it wove into the fabric of Ava's legacy. Proof that one moment of cruelty, seen and challenged, can ripple outward until it changes everything. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and share this video so more people can hear this story.